Well, in that song, the last song that we sang there, it's your breath in our lungs. And I'm reminded by that song, and I love that reminder that the breath that I have belongs to God. It was a gift given to me. And so with God's breath in my lungs, one of the greatest privileges that I know is getting to study his word, getting to know his word, and getting to teach his word. Something that Katie and I try to do on a weekly, daily basis in our home with family devotions, but something that I have much joy getting the opportunity to do this morning here with you. In a couple of other songs there, we said, Lord, let your name be lifted higher, lift it higher, lift it higher. And this morning, if Jesus doesn't have the ultimate seat in your life, if Jesus doesn't sit on top of every other thing that you have going on, then my goal as a teacher, my prayer to God through the Holy Spirit is that he would minister to you in such a way that he would be lifted higher. And for those of us who already have Jesus sitting on high in our lives, that we would just continue to magnify him, and that truth, that reality would radiate out from us into the lives of other people. All preaching should seek its end in the glorification of Jesus to this magnificent seat high above everything else in our lives. And so that's my prayer this morning. Well, my quiver is full. That's a weird thing to say, I feel like, but it's biblical. It's literally right out of the Bible, but everybody tells me, oh, you've got a fourth kid, your quiver is full. And, when I met Katie, we were only a couple of weeks into dating, and I don't know, I was one of those weird people who just talked about things down the future early on, but I told her when I met her, I was like, I kind of want to have like 6 kids or something like that. Like, I kind of like the idea of having a big family. I think when I was growing up, I wanted more siblings. I had cousins who had 7 siblings, so there's 8 of them, and I just thought that was so cool. Like, you would always have like a whole baseball team almost sitting there in your living room. So I thought that would be a great thing. So I told Katie, I kind of want to have, like 6 kids, and she very definitely let me know that if I married her, I would only get 4, okay? And that seemed good enough to me. She seemed worth the sacrifice of 2 of my children. Not after they're born, before, don't clip that off and put that online. But she seemed, so I knew I was only going to get 4 kids. So now we have 4 kids. Here it is. My quiver is full in that way. We've been so blessed by the people of this church. You guys do something called Meal Train. And we've had that kind of a thing done for us before. But what sticks out here is like people just went like all out for the Meal Train. Like, we got delicious food. We got like a lasagna that just blew the doors off of most of the other lasagnas I've ever had in my life. And just some chicken and stuffing. And just all these different things that was so good that it seriously has us considering having a 5th kid, just so we can do the Meal Train again. But I told Katie, probably one of us can just have a surgery or something like that, and we can get the Meal Train that way. It's no big deal. But before we have kids, we say a lot of things about our kids, don't we? We think a lot of things about other people who have kids that once we have kids, we realize maybe wasn't the wisest thing to think, to say, to predict about our children. I've heard people say, my kids are going to be tough, right? They're going to be hard workers. My kid's not going to throw a fit in public, right? I see the kid in Walmart on the ground, crying because they didn't get a bag of M&Ms, and you're like, wow, my kids will never be like that. And then you have kids, and they're just like that, right? My kids are going to be obedient. They're going to mind their manners. I had a kind of irrational one that we joke about a lot, but I'm not a fan of tie-dye. I kind of think it's sort of girly. I think it's kind of weird. And so I always said, my boys are never going to wear tie-dye. But then when my father-in-law was in the hospital after having surgery, we thought, well, what can cheer him up? So I put on a tie-dye shirt and went and visited him, which probably wasn't the best deal for him. He was laughing pretty hard at that. But I always kind of said, my kids aren't going to wear tie-dye. I just think that's weird. We make these predictions, these statements about our children, sometimes wise, sometimes not. Those of you who have kids that are probably teenage or above are sort of, smirking on your face like you don't have as much control as you think you have over who your kid's going to be, right? But at my age, we still think we do. So we're trying our hardest to mold our kids into what we thought they were going to be. But we're going to be in Isaiah 42 starting out this morning. So you can finger over to there. In Isaiah 42, this is God revealing something about his son. This is God speaking hundreds of years before the Messiah comes, hundreds of years before Jesus is born, and he's saying, this is what my son's going to be like. Now, the difference between God and us is God's right. When he says something's going to happen, he knows it. He can predict it. He can control it, right? And so we see here an accurate, true depiction of who the Messiah is going to be. Now, Isaiah 42 stands out from other predictive passages in Isaiah in one way in particular in my mind. A lot of the predictions in Isaiah talk about specifics, details about where the Messiah is going to be born, how the Messiah is going to be born. He's going to be born of a virgin. Even specifics about where he's going to minister, how he's going to die. It even predicts how he's not going to look. It says that he's not going to be handsome, which is kind of, rude, whatever. But it says he's not going to have any defining characteristics that you're going to be like, oh, that person, when they found King Saul, they were like, oh, that's a king, Whoa, he's like head and shoulders above everybody else. This is a guy who can rule. When they found David, he was like this teenager, kind of rugged little kid, and like, that's a king. No, that was more of the Jesus thing. He was not going to be somebody who stuck out. So there's all those predictions about specifics. But in Isaiah 42, what we find is more of a prediction about Jesus's personality, or probably a better way to say it is, it's a prediction about Jesus's ministry style. What style of ministry? How is the Messiah going to act towards his people? And so that's what we read here. I'm going to start in verse 1. I'm going to read down through verse 4. Read along with me in your copy of Scripture. Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break. A smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he has established justice on the earth. In his teaching, the islands or the nations or the coastlines will put their hope. Here's this prediction that God makes about his coming son, hundreds of years before he comes. Now, one of the things that's awesome, when I'm in the midst of my struggles, when I'm in the midst of doubts, which is the series that we're in, we're looking at doubt, the elephant in the room. When I'm in the midst of these things, seeing things that God actually predicted, that we have a copy of Isaiah from before Jesus was born, and then seeing it lived out in the life of Jesus just builds up my confidence in who God is, in his goodness, in his truthfulness, and in who Jesus is as the true Messiah. But I want to focus in on verse 3. There's a couple of metaphors in verse 3, a couple that I have not always considered a whole lot as to what they really mean. It's sort of just a read over it kind of thing, like, oh, okay. A bruised reed he will not break. A smoldering wick he will not snuff out. A bruised reed he will not break. A smoldering wick he will not snuff out. Now, I in my study this last week, I listened to an Alistair Begg message, partially because I just love his accent. If you haven't heard Alistair Begg, go to truthforlife.org. It's worth it just for the accent, right? But he's actually a really knowledgeable guy. And he was explaining these metaphors a little more closely. He said, both reeds and wicks, which you would use for like a lamp to light your house when it was dark, because they didn't have electricity, right? So you if you're going to do anything after dark in your house, you had to have a wick in your lamp. And a reed was used often for writing, but also it was known for being used by shepherds. Out in the field, they would come by a reed, they would break it off, and they would kind of carve it into this little flute, fiddle, or not fiddle, but a flute sort of thing. They would play on it, but it wasn't strong. And as they played over time, it would bruise, it would get to where it couldn't be used anymore. And so there's this reed that now is no longer valuable for anything. It's been used up, and now it's valueless, worthless. A smoldering wick, like a piece of flax that is dipped in oil and then is sitting there and it's burning. When it's useful, when it's burning, it gives light and joy to the house. It allows you to be productive and do stuff after dark. But when it's burnt all the way down to where it's sitting in the oil and it's just smoldering, not only is it not giving off enough light to do anything, but also it's producing smoke, filling your house with smoke, making it actually a hindrance to you. These two pictures, the thing they have in common is something that once was valuable, something that once was strong and useful, has now been used up in such a way that people see no value in it. If you were to try and sell these things, they would not sell for even pennies. They were worthless at this point. And it says that the coming Messiah, he will see a bruised reed and he won't crush it. He won't break it. He's going to see value in it. A smoldering wick, he's not going to snuff it out. He's going to find value in the things that people thought were valueless. There is a tenderness coming in this Messiah. There is a ministry of building back up broken things, taking what the world would say is useless and giving it value, replanting the reed, reigniting the wick. That's what God predicts about his son, his ministry style, his personality. Now, this is incredibly good news. And we see it happening all over the New Testament. This is incredibly good news for a foreign, adulterous woman at a well because Jesus spoke to her. An act that his disciples found literally disgusting, that he would speak to this foreign, adulterous woman. It was good news to a short, greedy tax collector who was hated by all the people around him because Jesus saw him and he went and he ate with him. And it was good news to a deaf, mute man because Jesus touched him and healed him. Although Jesus spit on his hand before he touched his tongue, which is gross, but if you were mute and blind, you would want that to happen too if you could, if that meant that you could hear and you could speak again. So all over the New Testament, all over Jesus's ministry, we see that Jesus is taking things that the world would have cast away, would have been done with. A greedy tax collector, a woman who her sins were known. She was known as an adulterous woman, and she lived in a foreign land. Jews weren't a big fan of Samaritans. These are people that Jews would have considered nothing. Cast them out. They're no good. They're not a part of us. They're not a part of our plan. And Jesus sees them and he says, I have value here. I'm going to build them up. And the good news for us today is it's also good news for those who are struggling with their doubts. It's also good news for those who are struggling in their doubts. Pastor Josh, when he talked to me about the concept of this sermon series, he talked to me about, doubts aren't a good thing necessarily. We don't brag about our doubts. We're not boasting that we have doubts. But the thing is, doubts in our lives, for many of us, are a reality. It just, those things do exist. They crop up from time to time, sometimes alone in a certain situation, or sometimes circumstances happen, and all of a sudden creeps in these doubts about the truth or the understanding of the way that things work in your faith, and you start to question some things. And that reality is a reality for many of us. Many of us experience doubts. Few of us talk about them. The goal of this sermon series is absolutely not that we boast in our doubts, that we're proud that we doubt, that we're excited that we doubt. In fact, the New Testament often talks about don't doubt when you come to the Lord, because those who doubt, they're tossed around like chaff in the wind, like waves of the sea blowing you back and forth. You're not steady in that state. But the point of the sermon series is that if the reality is that we do have doubts, then the way to deal with our doubts is not to pretend like they don't exist, is not to pretend like they're not there, or not to hide them in hopes that they'll just go away. Hiding your doubt only gives it a place to fester. It's like an infection. Those of you who have been in medical situations before, when people have an infection, it doesn't usually just go away on its own. They've got this wound and this infection. You have to go in, you have to shine light on it, you have to clean out the infection and then let the body heal after that. The infection, when left to its own devices, you come back in and the infection has spread. It's given place to fester and to grow. And so the whole point of this series is come to a spot where you can admit your doubts to yourself. You can bring them out into the light of the gospel. You can share them with other believers and have them help come alongside of you. And so that's the point. And so today we see Jesus and how tender he is towards doubters. So this bruised reed, smoldering wick talk about him not crushing these things, this is great news to those who struggle with their doubts. 2 weeks ago, Pastor Josh talked about Thomas, the man who after the resurrection had a hard time believing that Jesus actually raised from the dead. Thomas was a person who was asked to believe something that all of his life experience would have said was impossible, that the man he saw die is now alive again. And he said, I need proof. Thomas doubted because he had a lack of proof. Last week, Pastor Josh addressed John the Baptist, the first person to kind of point to Jesus and say, hey, the man coming after me, he's greater than me. I'm like a voice proclaiming in the wilderness that someone else is coming. John the Baptist is sort of the first one to hint that, hey, the Messiah is on his way. And yet when John was in prison, knowing that he was about to die, all of that anxiety, all of that fear, and not seeing the fruits of what he thought he was going to see with Jesus, struggles with some doubts. He sends a messenger, and Jesus sends messages back to him to proclaim what they see, which are all predictive things of the Messiah. And so he speaks gently to John the Baptist. He deals gently with Thomas. He doesn't condemn Thomas because of his doubt. He shows him his hands and his feet. He lets him put his fingers in his side. And so he was gentle with both of them. But this morning, we're going to be turning to the book of John, chapter 13. And we want to see this bruised reed playing out in the life of a person that we're very familiar with. His name is Peter. Although we don't attach Peter as a doubtful person the way that we do with Thomas, I want to walk through his life with you. And I would suggest that some of what we attribute to Peter, maybe we're a little off base on. Maybe his struggles were a little less what we think they are and a little more on the he struggled with doubt side of things. Now, we're going to be in John chapter 13 to start. We're going to jump into a few snippets in the future from there. But let me just bring you up to speed on Peter real quick. Peter was a fisherman. Jesus meets him, this ordinary fisherman, and helps him to catch the most massive, incredible catch of his life. He would have been famous and rich for the amount of fish that they pulled in on this one catch. And yet Jesus says, leave it behind and follow me. And Peter does. So Peter leaves everything behind and follows Jesus. In Matthew 16, Peter is the first person to confess that Jesus is the specific Messiah. Jesus says to his disciples, who do people say I am? And they're saying, Elijah. They say that you're a prophet, that you're a great teacher. And then he says, who do you say I am? And Peter just pipes right up and says, you're the Messiah. You're the Messiah. And so he's the first one to proclaim that Jesus is the Messiah. And then in John 13, verse 37 to 38, where we're at here is the Last Supper. We're at this meal that they're having together with Jesus in the Passover festival time period here. And Jesus has just declared that somebody is going to betray him. And Judas is pointed out as that person. Judas leaves, and Jesus is talking to his disciples. He says, I am going to go somewhere. Where I go, you can't follow me. Someday you will follow me, but for now you could look for me, but you won't be able to follow me. And this is extremely distressing to a man named Peter who gave up everything to be with Jesus. He's like, what do you mean I can't follow you? What do you mean we can't be with you? And so Peter answers back or asks in verse 37, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Then Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Now, if you're following along in our notes, point number 1 finds itself right here. It's an incredibly encouraging idea to me in the midst of my doubt that God anticipates your doubt. God's not surprised that you struggle with doubt. It's not like all of a sudden you have doubts and God's like, what? Are you kidding me? Like, I created you. I gave you the breath in your lungs. How dare you doubt me? Now, on the one side of things, very true. How dare we doubt him? On the other side of things, he knows that it's going to happen. He knew all the thoughts in my head before I was born. I don't catch him off guard. He's not surprised by it. And so when Peter here says, I would lay down my life for you, Jesus already knows the struggle that he's about to go through. Jesus already knows the struggle that he's about to go to. Now with Peter, we often kind of judge Peter as this person who's brash to kind of stand up and speak out, but like hasn't really thought it through and doesn't really mean everything that he says. And I think that's a little unfair. Okay, I think that that's a little bit unfair. If we go to John 18, is where we're going to jump to next. Jesus goes through a few passages of teaching to his disciples, and then he does this prayer, this great example of prayer in John 17 called kind of the high priestly prayer, sort of what we call that. But then we get into verse 18, and this is Jesus' actual betrayal and his capture in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the soldiers come with the high priests and some of the high priest's servants. And these Roman soldiers are with them, ready to take Jesus captive and put him on trial. And in this dark garden, as they come to take Jesus, listen at verse 7. Jesus says again to them, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you're looking for me, let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken might be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave to me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Now, I want to challenge our previous conception of how weak Peter was. Peter says, "I would die for you, Jesus." And Jesus says, "Would you really? You're going to deny me." And so I do believe that Jesus is right in saying, you're not really ready to die for me. And that's the key. Was Peter really ready to die for Jesus? Because in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter was ready to die for what he thought was going on. He drew a sword in the presence of Roman centurions. He's not a Roman citizen. In that day, Jews have very few rights. To draw a sword in the presence of a Roman centurion could have been a death sentence. Easy. But Peter was willing to die for what he thought was going on. I think Peter proves himself true that he was ready to die for what he thought Jesus was doing. But Jesus says, "Put your sword away. You don't know what I'm doing. Peter, you have a misconceived idea of what I'm all about." Peter's world is turned upside down when Jesus is caught, when he's captured, when he surrenders, when he's now on trial. Peter knows what's about to happen. He knows that the high priest, that the people, they want to crucify Jesus. He sees what's coming. And everything he conceived about what was happening for the last 3 years with Jesus is just flipped upside down, and he's left in this faith tailspin trying to figure out how could this be. I mean, he was the first person to proclaim Jesus as Messiah. Now, if you'll humor me for a minute, you can turn there if you want, but I want to read you a couple of other predictive passages from Isaiah. And I want to see if we can get into the head of Peter here and understand why he had such a hard time conceiving that Jesus had to die, that Jesus had to surrender to soldiers and be crucified. I want to see if we can get inside of his head here, because this isn't the first time that Jesus had to rebuke Peter for trying to get in the way of his plan. In fact, in Mark chapter 8, right after Peter says, "Hey, you're the Messiah," then Jesus says, "Hey, the Messiah, I have to suffer and die, and then 3 days later I'll come to life." I mean, very specific prediction of what's going to happen to him. And Peter pulls him aside. It's like, "Jesus, stop saying that stuff. You're not gonna die. You're not gonna be crucified." And Jesus rebukes him. In fact, strongly rebukes him and says, "Get behind me, Satan." So Peter before has had this struggle with trying to get in the way of what Jesus is trying to do. Jesus is trying to surrender to these soldiers. Peter pulls out his sword and chops off an ear. Not exactly one of David's 30 mighty men, right? Not the guy you probably want at your side if you're trying to have a bodyguard there. But Peter chops off an ear. So what's going on in Peter's head? Why does Peter have such a hard time understanding what Jesus has to do? I'm going to read from you Isaiah 9. I'm going to read a portion there, and then I'm going to jump forward to Isaiah 53. Just listen, and I'll kind of point out what we have going on here. Isaiah 9, chapter 9, verse 2. Now, this is often a Christmas passage for us, but here we are in October reading from Isaiah 9. The people walking in great darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the deep darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoicing at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. And catch verse 4 here. For as in the day of Midian. Now Midian was where Gideon and the 300 men went up against the Midianite soldiers, right? These 300 people versus this innumerable force, and God miraculously delivers victory against all odds. That was the day of Midian. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressors. Every warrior's boot in the battle, every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, for fuel in the fire. For to us a child is born. A son is given. This is the prediction that Jesus will come as Messiah, and the government will be on his shoulders. I'm going to skip a couple of verses, or a little bit here. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establish it and uphold it with justice and righteousness from that time on forever. Now, this is also a predictive truth about who Jesus was going to be. Jesus was going to be a conqueror, a warrior who defeats and overthrows the oppression of his people and establishes David's kingdom and sits on it from that day until forever. Now, sometimes, often, maybe always, when we come into situations, we bring expectations. I brought expectations into my marriage. I brought expectations into parenting, like I spoke about before. I've brought expectations with me all over the place. It's almost natural. It's very hard to walk into a situation without any expectations. But expectations can be terribly dangerous when held to and clung to too tightly. Now, to a person who's in captivity, who for hundreds of years has either been deported, their country has been deported from their land, or they're living in their land but not free to exercise their own will in their land. Now being a part of Roman capture, they're in their land, but they're brutalized. They're made an example of. They're not allowed to practice all of their own laws. They're a prisoner in their own house. To that kind of a person, when they read Isaiah 9, they would grab that and say, please, Messiah, come. I can't wait for you to overthrow the Romans. I can't wait for you to get rid of these people. I can't wait for you to bear the sword and conquer them like in the day of Midian, to establish David's throne forever and ever and ever. I'm so excited about that. And they cling to that truth. But to a person who can understand Isaiah 9 and what it meant, they equally should have been able to understand Isaiah 53. I'm going to read a couple of sparse verses in Isaiah 53. He had no beauty, the coming Messiah had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire. Verse 3, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, familiar with pain. Verse 5, but he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our sins. The punishment that brought us peace was placed upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Verse 7, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, as a sheep before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. Peter knows Isaiah. But his extreme desire, and he's not the only one. There are other examples. We'll see another example in a minute. He's not the only one. But many Jews at that time were so blind to the suffering servant that the Messiah must be, because they were so laser focused on the Roman imprisonment around them, that they had been captured, that all they could see in Isaiah is, set us free, overthrow the government, establish David's kingdom forever. That's all they saw. But they had a blind spot to that Jesus must come and suffer and die. He has to be led away like a lamb to the slaughter. He has to lay down his life. Both very true things. Jesus fulfills all of Isaiah 53. Jesus only partially fulfills Isaiah 9, but will fully fulfill Isaiah 9 in all of eternity. He will, at his next advent, come back. At his next coming, he will fulfill, in a more real sense, Isaiah 9. Both are true of this Messiah. But Peter was laser focused on Isaiah 9, waiting for a king who's going to triumph. And so when Jesus says, the Son of Man must suffer and die, and then will be raised after 3 days, Peter's like, nope, that's not what Isaiah 9 says. It says you're going to live forever. It says you're going to reign on the throne. Stop talking like this, Jesus. When he says, I'm going somewhere, you won't be able to find me, I have to suffer. Or when he's handing himself over to the Roman authorities, Peter's like, nope, this isn't right. Jesus, you got it wrong. I mean, he's rebuking the Messiah, right? That's crazy. But I don't think that Peter was unwilling to die for what he thought the Messiah was going to be. I think what Jesus is saying to him is, are you really willing to die for me, for who I really am? And Peter had a blind spot to that. What happens next, I'll summarize for time's sake, but you know it well, most likely. Jesus is on trial, and Peter's trying to kind of be close to kind of figure out what's happening. He's brought in to where Jesus is on trial. He's warming himself by a fire, and a servant girl says, wait, weren't you with him? Aren't you one of them? And Peter's like, no, not me, please. I'm not one of them, believe me. And then another person comes to him. Yeah, I think you were one of them. It's like, no, not me. Please. I'm not associated with this Jesus guy. And then finally, like a cousin of the guy who he chopped the ear off, who was like there in the garden. So she definitely recognizes Peter. She's like, this is the guy who chopped my cousin's ear off, you know? She's like, no, yep, this is the guy. He's with him. And he's like, no, guys, you got it all wrong. I just have one of those faces, right? You've got me wrong. And he denies Jesus 3 times, just as Jesus said that he would. Now, in that moment, what's happening for Peter? Is he afraid to suffer for the Messiah? I don't think that he is. I don't think that he is because of what he did in the Garden of Gethsemane, because he drew a sword in the presence of Roman soldiers. I think that he was ready to die. I think in this moment, Peter's faith is in this tailspin of doubt and struggling to figure out, how can this be? I know Jesus is the Messiah, but what's he doing here? How is he going to establish his kingdom in front of these people on trial? How is he going to get out of this thing? I don't understand. And in the midst of that doubt, he just really wasn't ready at that moment. He was a bruised reed, broken down by faulty expectations, misunderstandings. In fact, that's point number 2 in our notes. Our misguided understandings and expectations will cause us doubt. Or I think I just put cause doubt. Our misguided understandings, our off-target expectations. When we bring expectations into this thing, it will cause us doubt. I mean, the very same thing happens in marriage. I love my wife very much. She is amazing. And it's really easy to say that after, she gives birth, and you just see like her taking care of this baby and then also managing other children in your house and somehow mentally keeping it all together. She's an incredible, incredible woman. I've been blessed in massive ways. But I brought expectations into marriage that I didn't even necessarily know that I had. And when those things weren't met, or when there was something different than what I expected. Like everybody always tells you, oh, your other half, they're going to balance out your weaknesses. Well, Katie has some of the same weaknesses I do, and we just tailspin together into oblivion, right? Some ways in which we struggle. And we're like, is this really the right person for me? Because, when I'm being lazy on the couch and she, like, what's going on here? Somehow I expected that she was just going to be this miracle worker and just make me a better person. And in many ways, God has used her to make me a better person. But those expectations when I came in, when they aren't met, you start to question, wait, is this the right person for me? Sorry, Katie. I've told you that though. But I know she is. It wasn't like that logical. But these expectations, when they're unmet, cause you to doubt things. I thought I was going to be a good dad. I thought I was going to stay calm. I thought that my dad's anger struggles, and they weren't insane anger struggles, but he had a boiling point. He was a pretty calm person, but he was more like a teapot, right? It just, all of a sudden, it's all coming out at once, right? Volcano style. I thought that I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be able to keep my calm because, hey, at my job, I'm able to keep my calm. And, in interacting with my wife, I'm able to keep my calm. And talking to friends, I'm able to keep my calm. But kids are different. The kids are different. If you don't have kids yet, they're different. They don't see the warning signs that, they don't see the smoke coming out of the top of the mountain. They just keep pushing and going, and eventually you just, oh, I remember my dad doing that, right? My dad was a great person, don't get me wrong. He was a wonderful example, but he had his weaknesses. I expected that I wasn't going to be that person. I brought in a faulty expectation that I was going to be able to keep it together better than he had. And I began to doubt how good I am as a dad because of that. Our misguided understandings or expectations will cause us doubt when you're let down. I mean, classic example, when a kid expects that, oh, if I pray to God for a baseball bat and God says, anything you ask for in my name, I will give you. He has this misunderstanding of what Jesus is really saying there. He doesn't get a baseball bat. He's like, maybe Jesus isn't real. I didn't get a baseball bat. But he has a misunderstanding of what Jesus is really proclaiming there. When you believe, maybe a little more close to home, that God is love, he's the definition of love, then you have sometimes this understanding or this mindset in your mind that, of course God won't let my mom get cancer. Of course God won't let my child die. And when those things happen, it can rock your world. Part of what's going on there is, like Josh said last week, it's just emotion. It's not rational. It's not thought produced. It's just this emotion that causes you to doubt. But part of it also is you had a misunderstanding of God's love, or you had a misunderstanding of the world that we live in, broken by sin. We have a misunderstanding of what's going on, and that's going to lead you towards mountains of doubt. Peter certainly is in a tailspin, doubting everything that he thought was true, wondering, is this the Messiah? I'm ready to suffer for the Messiah. I'm ready to suffer so that Rome will be overthrown. But what's going on here? I can't even. So he denies Jesus 3 times. And so we come back to that question that I mentioned at the beginning, or at least I hope I mentioned at the beginning. The question is, in our doubts, who is God? Who is God in the midst of our doubts? Or maybe better put, when you're doubting, how does God treat you? How does God think about you? How does God relate with you in the middle of your doubts? And so we see Peter crushed by his doubts and probably feeling pretty awful because of his reaction and the way that he acted. And so I want to lead you to John 21. If you'll flip to John 21 with me. Jesus died on the cross. He rose from the grave. Some women realized he wasn't in the tomb. Some other guys went back and checked it. Like, yep, not in the tomb. They're all hanging out together in this house, and all of a sudden, door locked kind of deal. Jesus just appears, whether it came through the wall or just appeared or whatever. He's there with them. Peter's a part of that, and he sees him. He's like, oh, he's here. And Peter's excited about that. But then there's another time that Jesus appears to Peter, and I want you to see it in chapter 21. Now, what's happening here is Peter's out with some friends fishing. Now, I don't think that it's insignificant, although the text doesn't point it out specifically, so I'll give that disclaimer. This is Mark's interpretation, not explicitly said in the text. But I don't think it's insignificant that Peter is out doing what Jesus told him to leave behind. Jesus found him as a fisherman and caused him to catch many fish and said, let go of these and I will teach you to catch men. I'll make you a fisher of men. I don't think it's insignificant that Peter, now a bruised reed who's been beaten up by misguided expectations, by self-doubt, and now beaten up by his own actions of denying Christ 3 times. I don't think it's insignificant that he goes back to his former lifestyle, that here he is out fishing again, which if I were Jesus, I would look at and be like, oh, he's done. He's worthless. He went back to what he loved before. But Jesus sees him and acts in a completely different way. He again calls for them to throw their nets over the other side. They reel in a massive amount of fish. They come, he cooks them breakfast. And when they had finished eating, in verse 15, Jesus says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? You went back to fishing, but do you love me, now that you know who I really am? Do you love me more than these? Everything that you've known in your life that brings you comfort and security and joy, the food that provides for your family, the food that provides money for your shelter, do you love me more than these? And Jesus says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus says, feed my lambs. And again he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, take care of my sheep. And the 3rd time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a 3rd time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. The issue wasn't Jesus' knowledge of what was going on in Peter's heart. The issue is that Jesus wanted to give Peter an opportunity to respond to the 3 times that he had denied Jesus. Jesus here gives him 3 chances to override that denial and say, no, Lord, I do. I love you. He comes along a bruised reed and he doesn't crush it. He doesn't say you're worthless now. He doesn't say, hey, you've doubted me. That means you're an unbeliever. I'm done with you. No, he says, I know you had your doubts. I know you had your misunderstandings, but 3 times I'm going to give you a chance to reaffirm your love for me. And then the response to all 3 was, then feed my sheep or my lambs. Take care of the people that I originally brought you up to take care of. See, when Peter said, you are the Messiah, Jesus responds to him in Matthew 16, on this rock, Peter means rock, Jesus is using a wordplay, that on this confession that I am the Messiah, I'm going to build my church. But what he's also doing there is he's saying, Peter, you're going to be a leader in my church. You're going to be one of the people who builds my assembly. He had commissioned Peter to be this person. And then Peter, broken by all of his bruised reedness, that's not a word, but Peter, broken by his doubts, by his denials, doesn't feel like that person anymore. And Jesus says, Peter, you are who I say you are. You are who I made you to be. And when I say that you are going to be a part of the establishment of my church, then you will. I'll give you that power. I'm going to use you even though you see yourself as worthless right now. You are who I say that you are. Jesus is incredibly tender and encouraging towards doubters. Point number 3. Jesus is tender and encouraging towards doubters. Peter, as a bruised reed, he did not crush. Or the wick, the smoldering wick, he will not stamp out. Listen, you don't have to go there. Just listen as I tell you one more story in the New Testament here. Luke 24, there are a couple of disciples, people who had come to the festival in Jerusalem, knowing about Jesus, excited about Jesus, burning with passion to see, hey, Jesus is going up to Jerusalem, where they knew people were waiting to kill him. So this must be the Messiah's time to come and establish his kingdom, overthrow Roman rule, overthrow the Pharisees, and establish his rule. And they were pumped and excited coming into town just a week before. Excited for what was going to be happening. Probably 2 of the people laying down palm branches and crying out that Jesus is the Messiah, right? The son of David. Hosanna. And when they're walking away from the festival, Jesus meets them when they're discussing all the things that happened. And he says, what are you talking about? Now Jesus has hid himself from them, so they don't know it's Jesus. They just think it's a guy asking. They're like, what? You don't know what happened this week? We thought this guy was the Messiah, but instead he was crucified. Listen to verse 21 in Luke 24. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel, buy them back from their bondage. We had hoped that. But it says that they were standing there, they stood still with their faces downcast. In their hearts they had a wick that used to be on fire for the Messiah and now is only smoldering, putting out more smoke than light. They're useless in their faith. They don't understand. They're struggling with their doubts that Jesus really was who he said he was. And Jesus explains the scriptures to them. He walks through Genesis, through Isaiah, through all of these scriptures to show, hey, the Messiah was supposed to suffer and die. On the other side of that, in verse 32, once Jesus is gone, they said to each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and he opened the scriptures to us? The smoldering wick. Jesus saw these disciples struggling to understand, struggling in their doubts. I'm sure he wasn't super proud about how strong their knowledge was in that moment, but instead of condemning them, instead of crushing them, instead of casting them out, instead of snuffing out the little bit of fire they had left, Jesus ignites them by teaching them the scripture. He walks alongside of them. He builds them up. And so we see that Jesus truly is who God said he was going to be. He won't crush the broken reed, the bruised reed. He won't snuff out the smoldering wick. And so for application today, what I want you to see is that Jesus is tender with you in your doubt. That in the midst of your doubt, sometimes it's hard to feel what God is talking to you about. It's hard to sense and to know. Sometimes Andrew Peterson has a song that I love. It's called The Silence of God. Sometimes in my doubts, I just feel this great silence from God. And it just breaks me apart. And I'm like, God, say something. Do something. Bring something into my life to shake me and let me know that you're here. And sometimes in the midst of my doubts, he just feels incredibly silent. But it's good to see that Jesus is tender with doubters. To know that the character of the Messiah and therefore the character of God is one of coming alongside and loving, building up, not tearing down. Because he says to me, Mark, you are who I said you are. You're my child, and I love you. To know that and to see that in Jesus' example is so important. But one of the things that we're asking that you do in this sermon series, we asked week 1, just take time to write down 1 or 2 things. Just put it on paper. 1 or 2 doubts that you really have. Just expose it to the light of writing it out. Expose it to yourself. And then last week, I think Josh challenged you to find someone inside of this congregation that you can just tell them, hey, these are 1 or 2 things that cause me doubt. Now do that in a concise time. Don't blab their ear off for like 4 hours, but just give them a chance to hear that. Allow them to minister to you because of that. So point 2 in our application is found in Romans 8:29. You should be made into the image of Jesus. There it says that he predestined you, he justified you. All of these things that he did for you, he did so that you could be made into the image of him, of the Son. And so if we're supposed to bear Jesus' image, and if we're supposed to be his hands and feet in ministry, carrying on the kind of ministry that he established, then when a brother or sister comes to you with a doubt, you have to be incredibly tender and loving and kind towards that person. Sometimes we have a tendency when somebody exposes a doubt to us, we're either so afraid of our own doubts and so trying to suppress our own doubts that we just want to squash it, right? Or they're struggling with something that we've already leaped over and we're already beyond and we understand, and the instant desire is just to just hit them with knowledge, right? And just beat them down with, oh, that's dumb, like, don't you know this, don't you know that? That's not going to help that person be open in the future. It's not going to make them feel like you hear, you love, and you're concerned. Now, certainly there is a place for speaking truth. It's a very big and necessary part of this process. But we need to be tender and gentle and loving in our response to those who come to us with their doubts. Coming alongside of them is the example that Jesus set. Coming down to their level. He didn't sit from on high and say, you need to get up here. What Jesus did was he humbled himself and descended, became like us, took on our form, We need to set the same example as we treat other people who are struggling and inside of their doubts. So hear them, walk beside them, bear their burden, bring them to the Father in prayer, and then speak truth gently to them. That's my encouragement, that when you see a bruised reed, when you see a wick that's just smoldering, the person's not too far. Come along gently beside them. Show them the love that Christ has shown you. Let's pray. Lord, you have treated us better than we deserve just by giving us a second chance. But Jesus, we see in your example that you give us chance after chance, that you bear with us in our weakness. You're the man of all sorrows. You understand all the temptations that we've gone through, and you take the time to come down alongside of us and show us tenderness in the midst of our doubt, in the midst of our struggle. So Lord, I pray and I beg you that you would make us a people and give us a heart to be kind and gentle and loving towards one another, being honest enough to expose our doubts and caring enough to walk with one another in those and through those. We trust that you will do this, Jesus, in your powerful name. Amen.